Some people do what must be done. Now say these hole in the fabric that must be sewn. They see the way blockaded and they roll back the stone. They see the day beyond the horizon and they do what must be done. Yes, some people do what must be done. Well, they do what must be done. Well, they see the day beyond the horizon, and they do what must be done. Now I've seen the toll taken and the tears that were shed. I've seen the journey started and the ripples spread. Some people say that's just not my problem. Some people do what must be done. Now they see the hole in the fabric that must be sewn. They see the way blockaded and they roll back the stone. They see the day beyond the horizon and they do what must be done. Yeah, some people do what must be done. Well, they do what must be done. They see the day beyond the horizon, and they do what must be done. Sometimes the darkness is all that we see. We can't envision what the future will be. But in our hearts is that which will guide us, so we can do what must be done. We see the hole in the fabric that must be sewn. We see the way blockaded and we roll back the stone. We see the day beyond the horizon and we do what must be done. And so we do what must be done. Well, we do what must be done. We see the day beyond the horizon, and we do what must be done. We see the day beyond the horizon, and we do what must be done.
Good morning from here at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Silver Spring. My name is Bruce McConachie. I'm today's worship associate. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm so glad to welcome you to our second hybrid worship service. This morning we have a limited capacity congregation here with me in the sanctuary, and people attending virtually on Zoom, and our children and youth are having RE outside today. However you are joining us, I'm so glad you're here. If you're participating in person in the sanctuary today, there are some important things to keep in mind. First, be sure to wear your mask correctly over both your nose and mouth, and stay distanced from people who are not in your household. Second, if you need to use the restroom downstairs, please do so one person at a time or household at a time. Third, as per the recommendations of the UU Musicians Network and the UUA itself, we still cannot allow singing with hymns or other music. Humming along, however, is now permitted. Okay. Finally, check your cell phones to make sure they are all turned off. 162 years ago last month, in an attempt to arm slaves for revolt, John Brown led a raid at Harper's Ferry. Of the 6 people who funded Brown's raid, 5 were Unitarians. This morning, we seek wisdom, warning, and courage from our traditions past and consider today's liberal and radical perspectives on how to build a better world. Our Director of Spiritual Growth, Laura Solomon, will be leading today's Time for All Ages, and our minister, the Reverend Kristin Grassel Schmidt, will be preaching. This morning, we are also glad to have Miyako Villanueva as our ASL interpretation. If you're joining UUCSS today, or if you're joining us, for the first time, I'm so glad you're here. Pat Hulsabash is our welcoming captain this morning. She will be glad to answer your questions from participants in the chat room after the service, and she'll be available here in the sanctuary to greet any newcomers in person. For those who have been worshiping with us through the pandemic, today's service will unfold in a familiar order, but a few pieces may feel different since we've had to make adjustments for the new hybrid setup. The switch to virtual services when the pandemic began was not without its challenges, as we all know. It took us a while to figure out how to do things in a way that, well, felt right. The transition to hybrid worship continues to have its own bumps, but our staff and volunteers are doing their best not only to make it all work, but to make it all meaningful. As always, we welcome your feedback, and we ask for your grace and understanding as we manage the many details. Every Sunday, we encourage people tuning in for worship to go and get a chalice, a flashlight, or a candle to join us in kindling our flame of community. If you don't have something handy now, I invite you to go and get it. This is also a time we express our gratitude to everyone who has contributed to today's service. Now, please join me in the words on your screen as we light our chalices and reaffirm our congregational commitment. May this light warm our hearts with love and guide us in the ways of truth. As we gather here for worship, we pledge ourselves to the endless search for truth, to the right of each to believe as mind, heart, and conscience dictate, to accept the responsibilities this freedom commands, and to implement our belief in the essential worth and dignity of every human being. May it be so. For those joining us virtually, I invite you to sing our song of exaltation. For those present with me in the sanctuary, please hum along.
Shall Come in rejoicing if joy is on your heart. Bring your praise and your sense of wonder. Fill this place with your gladness at life's sweetness and sweet surprise. Come in grieving if grief is in your bones. Bring your anger and your struggle, your deep disorientation, and your longing for what no longer remains, your longing for what has never been. Come in confessing if regrets burden your soul. Bring yourself in all of your humanity, your imperfections and your short-sightedness, your impatience and your struggle to be here in this moment as it is. Come in with all of yourself, just as you are, for here is a place for the living, a place for real life. This momentary, mundane, miraculous mess, here is a place for the remembering of all of it, all of ourselves, and the ways we remain connected in this common cause, held in a love that through it all calls us on. I invite those at home to join in singing our opening hymn number 1000 in the Teal Songbook, Morning Has Come. The words will be on the screen. And those with me here in the sanctuary to enjoy humming along.
Morning has come, arise and greet the day. Dance with joy and sing a song of gladness. The light of hope it shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. Once more the gift is given. Wonder fills this moment shared together. The light of peace it shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. Open our eyes to see that life abounds. Open hearts to welcome it among us. The light of love it shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home.
Good morning. I am going to tell you a story today. It's an old story, a folk tale from India. And like so many stories, this story begins with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there lived a king who cared for nobody but himself. He had grown rich from the high taxes he had forced people to pay, while they had become poorer and poorer. He lived in a gorgeous palace, while the poor people who built it for him still lived in thatched huts and tumble-down hovels. The king's table was always heaped with delicious foods, while most of his people had only one plain meal a day, and sometimes not even that. But the Heartless King did not care. He had what he wanted, and the people's suffering was far away from the palace. One day, a great hunter came to the palace gate. The hunter brought with him an enormous dog. The king loved hunting, and this enormous dog fascinated him. So the hunter and the dog were both welcomed into the palace grounds. But the enormous dog was no ordinary dog, and her bark was like a roar of thunder. The first time she opened her big mouth and barked, the awful noise shook the walls of the palace and frightened the king and all his people. Again and again, the fierce roaring shook the palace and the earth itself. Before long, there was no resting between barks. "Why does your dog make such a deafening noise?" the king asked the hunter. "The dog is hungry," the hunter replied. The king tried to satisfy the dog's hunger with plates of meat, but the dog would eat them and then immediately begin barking again. After a few rounds of this, the king was frustrated and ordered the hunter and his dog to leave. But the hunter was firm. "Your Majesty, we have been sent to you by one greater than you are. We are here to stay." The king was frightened. The king was not accustomed to having anyone speak to him in this manner. "Will nothing satisfy the hunger of your enormous dog?" the king said at last. "Nothing that is easy for you to give," said the hunter. "Your Majesty, there are a few people in this kingdom who are still eating all the food and who are not sharing it with the many who do the work in the field to make the food grow. There are many people who are always hungry. This dog feels the hunger of every person in this kingdom who does not have enough food to eat. As long as even one person is hungry, the dog will be hungry and will keep barking." The king was stunned. It had never entered his thoughts that he had been doing anything wrong. He had thought that the people of his kingdom were simply supposed to always do exactly what he wanted. It had never occurred to him that a king should think about the happiness of anyone except himself. The king thought for a long while about how to solve this problem and get the dog to stop barking. Finally, the king made up his mind, and he ordered all of the palace servants to collect rice from the palace storerooms and fruits and vegetables from the palace gardens to give to the people in the kingdom. Servants hurried away to do as the king commanded, and a long line of carts, piled high with bags and baskets of food, rolled out through the palace gate. All day long, for 3 days, the carts kept going until they had gone to every village in the realm and every house had their fill. On the 3rd day, the enormous dog finally stopped barking and lay down quietly beside the king's chair. For the first time ever, everyone in the kingdom was well fed. All the people inside the palace ground were happy now that the dog was quiet. And everywhere in the land, the people who had been starving were now contented. For the next few years, the enormous dog stayed by the king's side to be sure the king never reverted to his old ways. A few times, the dog barked to remind the king about justice, and each time the king remembered the important lesson he had learned.
joining us in person and from the congregation joining us on Zoom. It's just a little bit tricky to get those to happen at the same time right now. This morning, we hold tenderly in heart and prayer Miyako Villanueva and her family as they mourn the death of Iola Schroeder, her grandmother, who passed away yesterday, November 6th at 6:30 in the morning. She was 100. May her memory be a blessing. We lift up all those families in our congregation and beyond who are dealing yet again with fear, overwhelm, and disruption as they quarantine after having been exposed to COVID at school. And alongside of our concern, we celebrate and give thanks for all those who are getting their booster shots and all of the children who are now getting their vaccines in the next few weeks. And finally, we hold in our hearts all those with children younger than 5 who are eagerly anticipating a vaccine for their precious little ones. As the world around us acts as if the pandemic is over, we remember those for whom the isolation and the waiting continues on. I now invite you into a time of quiet to honor the joys and sorrows shared and those held only in our hearts, to reflect on the week behind us, to notice what surfaces when we pay attention to our innermost selves, to center down into the truth of ourselves here and now. I'll conclude our time of quiet by ringing the singing bowl, and then I will invite you into a time of shared prayer. Let us now enter into a moment of quiet together. Gentle presence, patient listener, holy holder of it all, this is my prayer. I am so sad. It's not an ask, it's not a confession, it's an offering, the only one I have today. I'm praying it with hope. I know grief is a lifeline, tethering me to the world that should be the one worth fighting for. As a practice of faith, I will not deaden these feelings that let me know all is not well. I will not adjust to cruelty or disregard for life, detaching myself from humanity, mine or others. I will not allow once imaginable scenarios to be turned into everyday losses that no longer pierce my soul. And so here are my tears, and here is my tired body, And here is my foggy, distracted mind bearing witness to the place within that aches for those I love, for strangers and friends, for everyone being pushed into impossible situations. My sadness is a testimony. It is not my only one. Tomorrow, hope or fight or curiosity will bear their truth and pull me back into the labors I love in the company of others. But today, the only riot in me is this sorrow, refusing to quiet your cry from within. We are made for so much better than this. Amen. I now invite those tuning in from home to join in singing number 95, There is More Somewhere, More Love Somewhere. I invite everyone here with me in the sanctuary to hum along.
There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more hope somewhere. There is more peace somewhere. There is more peace somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more peace somewhere. There is more joy somewhere. There is more joy somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more joy somewhere.
A century and a half ago, many Unitarians around the United States were debating how to end slavery in much the same way many of us today are debating how to defeat fascism and racism. Some Unitarians in the 1850s opposed abolition because they had grown wealthy by selling clothing made with slave-picked cotton. Others wanted to end slavery, but preferred a gradual, progressive, peaceful approach so as not to disrupt the nation's slave-entangled economy. But a few abolitionists eventually became convinced that the goal of ending slavery through peaceful means was merely a stalling tactic, a way for progressives of their day to avoid having to disrupt the status quo. So in 1858, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Samuel Gridley Howe, Theodore Parker, Benjamin Franklin Sanborn, Gerrit Smith, and George Luther Stearns began meeting in secret with the radical John Brown to plan a raid on Harper's Ferry in order to arm slaves for rebellion. Of these men who have come to be called the Secret Six, 5 were Unitarians, and 2 of them Unitarian ministers. 158 years ago this week, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry failed. May our search through liberal and radical approaches to injustice in our religious past offer us wisdom and guidance in our work to overcome hate and injustice today. Today's first reading is an excerpt from The Secret Six, Violence and Nonviolence in Unitarian Universalism, a blog post by the Reverend Carl Gregg. He writes, with the benefit of hindsight, we can today see the ways in which the Secret Six were naive in supporting John Brown's raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, which had almost no chance of succeeding. At the same time, the Secret Six did risk their comfort and privilege to support Brown's armed insurrection because they had come to believe both that nonviolent legislative means of ending slavery had shown they had no chance of succeeding, and that the evil of human chattel slavery in the United States must be ended, including by means of violence, if necessary. And the historical consensus is that Brown's raid, even though it failed, did catalyze the movement towards civil war, causing many to view Brown as a martyr. Today's second reading is taken from the book, A Feminist Ethic of Risk by Unitarian Universalist professor Sharon Welch. She writes, it is easier to give up on long-term social change when one is comfortable in the present. When it is possible to have challenging work, excellent health care and housing, and access to the fine arts. When the good life is present or within reach, it is tempting to despair of its ever being in the reach for others and resort merely to enjoying it for oneself and one's family. Becoming so easily discouraged is the privilege of those accustomed to too much power, accustomed to having needs met without negotiation or work, accustomed to having a political and economic system that responds to their needs. Responsibility is equated with action that is more likely to succeed. Thus, identifying responsibility with action that is, by definition, supportive of the status quo. So ends the reading.
It's so good to see all of you this morning. Resistance to systems of hate, greed, and injustice has taken some interesting public forms in recent years, hasn't it? Cities and towns all over the country saw nonviolent demonstrations with the women's marches years ago and marches to protest police brutality a few months into the pandemic. In places like Standing Rock, North Dakota, and St. Louis, Missouri, protesters used nonviolent means to draw attention to injustice by disrupting the status quo. In many cases, protesters have used their bodies to block access to things like roads and bridges and bodies of water. We've seen Colin Kaepernick inspire thousands of players from professional football all the way down to high school teams who took a knee in protest of police brutality. And alongside nonviolent forms of protest, Antifa, at times, organized armed demonstrations against white supremacy. And right now, the US is experiencing the most widespread worker strike in living memory. All of these demonstrations, and many others like them, are like the dog that would not stop barking in this morning's story for all ages. It takes a lot of energy and persistence to draw attention to problems that people don't want to see. It's even harder if those people are like the king and have never had to come face to face with the problem before. And it's no surprise that so many people in our world have focused more on how to stop the barking rather than addressing the reasons society's many proverbial dogs are barking in the first place. Even more fascinating than the resistance itself are the efforts made to undermine and delegitimize it. Years ago, the congregation I was serving at the time was making hot food for Occupy protesters in the city of Boston. While taking the food to the protesters, I remember people shouting at me from their car windows, "Get a job, and I'm gonna run you over and you'll deserve it," out of their car windows. Protesters in St. Louis and other places who intentionally blocked access to roads and bridges as a means of drawing more attention to police brutality were often portrayed as irresponsible, immoral, and even evil for disrupting business as usual. Former Vice President Mike Pence once spent our tax dollars to go to an NFL football game specifically for the purpose of walking out when players took a knee during the national anthem. And last but not least, members of Antifa are being accused of having no moral integrity or being just as bad as the fascists they abhor because they're willing to use violence as part of their resistance. Our faith has a very long tradition of involvement in socially and politically controversial issues, a long history of struggling to discern whether to fix or fight the system. And as our readings this morning hint at, our forebears did not always agree, either about the issues themselves or the right way to resist injustice. Before John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, most Unitarians were abolitionists, but they overwhelmingly preferred a gradual ending to slavery. These were folks who wanted to fix the existing system. The Revolutionary War had ended only 7 decades before the raid, which means Americans in the 1850s would have grown up hearing just as many stories about the War of Independence as many of us grew up hearing about the Vietnam and Second World Wars. So it's no surprise that in that time, so many people wanted to avoid even the possibility of war, no matter the cost. But others viewed things differently. Theodore Parker's writings suggest his priority was the liberation of African Americans from the national sin of slavery at all costs. Reverend Parker preached passionately against the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required non-slave states to aid in the capture and return of former slaves who had fled within their borders. It said he even kept a gun behind the pulpit in order to protect formerly enslaved people in his congregation. And we know of at least one such refugee to whom he gave sanctuary in his own home. Though the issues we face today are different, it's telling that many of the arguments about tactics then and now are the same. Many of us here today, and many Unitarian Universalists in general, I think, favor trying to fix the system by pursuing gradual, progressive change through changing hearts and minds and laws. Others think trying to fix a system so broken is a waste of time and believe in fighting the system, working for justice regardless of popular opinion about their goals or their means. Now, for most of my life, I considered myself a progressive, and I was a dedicated pacifist. I engaged in nonviolent demonstrations as a teenager and later as a young adult when the then President Bush led many of my classmates to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I believed wholeheartedly in the moral superiority of nonviolence and would probably have been willing to give up my life for that ideal at that time. But then I had my first child. And suddenly, all of my systematically worked out theology and ethics were challenged by the realization, the reality of this beautiful baby whom I loved fiercely. And I knew the night that he was born that I would do anything and everything to keep him safe. And ever since that night, I've been wrestling with my faith. Because regardless of what I've believed most of my life about violence never being the answer, I also know in my bones that there is nothing more right in this world than protecting my children from danger at all costs. In our religious tradition, we are challenged to examine our faith, to carefully evaluate our beliefs. And it seems I'm being challenged to re-examine my beliefs about the use of force since my well-thought-out theology and what I know in my body don't perfectly match up. I think many Americans are likewise being challenged to re-examine some of the assumptions we may have held about whether it's worth it to try to fix our system, or whether we should prepare to fight it so we can build one that actually works for people who aren't wealthy, white, heterosexual, cisgender men. Progressive, peaceful change that builds momentum and brings people along makes an awful lot of sense intellectually. But when mothers send their teenage babies out at night with their friends and worry about what might happen to them at the hands of police, the promise of progressive change sounds like a cruel joke. The crux of the philosophical argument for nonviolence, as I understand it, is that the use of violence can never be justified, even if it is in the service of justice and liberation. In other words, it's morally bunk to use violence to achieve a nonviolent goal. It's hypocritical. And yet, as Brazilian theorist Paulo Freire argued, we also must ask ourselves if the brutal reality of life faced by millions of oppressed people in our country and our world can be justified, even if it would require violence to end their oppression. In his seminal book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire writes, "With the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. How could they be the initiators if they themselves are the result of violence? There would be no oppressed had there been no prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation." I've heard and read many people measure today's justice work against the example of the civil rights movement. Any protest in which violence occurs, no matter the circumstances or the initiator, is quickly criticized. But the realities we face today are different than what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. faced in the 50s and 60s. Many of the people who voted for and then culturally reinforced Jim Crow thought of themselves as morally right. That meant that putting those people in situations where they used violence to prevent Black people from doing simple things like drinking water from fountains revealed to them their own moral failure. That is how nonviolent non-cooperation is successful. But the problem in Germany in the 30s, and here in the United States, as we saw so spectacularly last January in the attack on the Capitol, is that fascists don't care about moral integrity. They don't care about the rule of law, and they don't care about our democracy. They do not care if they are morally right or not. There is no way to use their own actions to reveal their moral failure to them that might bring about a change of heart. There is no way to shame them into changing their ways because in many cases, fascists have no shame. I don't question the moral strength of the foundation of nonviolence or how effectively it has been used in the past. I also believe it can and will be effective in specific contexts again. But I do question the way I see nonviolence philosophy being used to try and delegitimize an awful lot of the dogs I hear barking in the country today, warning us of the injustice taking deeper and deeper root among us. Because if oppressed people feel they can be most effective at changing things and keeping their babies safe by using some form of force, the same force I know in my heart I'd use to protect my babies, who on earth am I to judge them? I don't think any of us, privileged not to face the same dangers, are in any position to judge the tactics of others. Because it is easy to forget that the institution of slavery was brought to an end with a war, not through slow, gradual, progressive change. The threat posed by the Nazis was ultimately defeated with force, not with pacifism. And the ongoing fight for LGBTQ liberation has not always been defined by peaceful pride marches. No, it included the markedly unpeaceful Compton's cafeteria riots in San Francisco and the Stonewall riots in New York City. Now, I want to be really clear. I do not lift up these examples to glorify them. I'm not doing that right now. I do not promote the use of violence. But I lift up these examples to acknowledge the tension between the commitment many liberals have to nonviolence and the very real ways that liberalism has benefited from the use of force under certain circumstances. It is a very real tension in our tradition that I think we would do better to examine rather than ignore or gloss over. In my 12 years in the ministry, I've heard from countless people concerned that focusing on justice work might take away from the church's pastoral care and support. Now, I must confess that this is not a distinction I've ever understood. Slavery was not some outside issue for Unitarians to fight just for the sake of other people. It was a real and present danger, a personal and pastoral issue for Frederick Douglass and other formerly enslaved people who worshiped at All Souls Church right down in Washington, D.C., just as one example. Racism is not some outside issue for this congregation. It is faced and lived with and struggled against every single day by this church's own members, families, neighborhoods, friends, and as such, it is absolutely a pastoral issue. But deciding how to resist injustice and oppression was not simple or straightforward in the 1850s, nor is it today. As our democratic institutions and their protections have crumbled under the weight of corporate greed and the collapse of the political right into autocracy, there are no easy answers. As Audre Lorde wrote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Ultimately, I think we need to acknowledge the extent to which the cause of justice has benefited from the work and sacrifice of radicals who began movements like the abolition of slavery, LGBTQ liberation, feminism, and Black Lives Matter. And I think we need to examine what's underneath our own sense of the right and moral way to work for justice, whether in our hearts, we want to fix or fight the system. The times in which we live and the realities we are facing headlong into 2022 challenge us to examine not just our position on issues, but how our philosophies, ethics, and theologies either reinforce or challenge the status quo. The times in which we live and the realities we face challenge us to de-center privileged voices and follow the lead of those for whom our system is unjust and deadly. So, my prayer today is that UUCSS be a space where we hold history with intention, where we re-examine our shared faith, our own beliefs and philosophies and ethics and theologies. May we be granted the humility to balance what sounds right intellectually with what our bones tell us is needed in the all too often brutal reality of our world. And may we find the courage to live out our commitments, giving all we can for the sake of our neighbors, for the sake of justice, for the sake of our children, and the world they will inhabit when all of us are gone. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen.
As the Reverend Vicky Weinstein reminds us, the offering is a sacrament of the free church. What we mean by that is that we believe it's a blessing to be able to govern and support our religious community ourselves, to make possible by our generosity everything we dream of and do and how to live out our shared values. Every week we lift up the spiritual value of generosity by taking an offering for the ministries of this church. Our offering plate, both literal and figurative, becomes filled with the evidence of that generosity. It is our harvest, gathered in every week for what most nourishes us. There are many ways you can make your financial gift today. The first is by downloading the Vanco Mobile Faith Engagement app to set up an account. For those of you who have been making offerings over the Give Plus mobile app, please know that the old app was retired last week. Please follow the instructions on the screen to download the new Vanco Mobile Faith Engagement app and select UUCSS in order to give. The second way to give is by using your phone to text a message to 833-880-1363. If the app or the texting just don't work for you, the third way is to give by mailing a check directly to UUCSS. If you are here in our church, feel free to drop your offering into one of the plates located at the rear of the sanctuary. We will not be passing the offering plates until further notice as a COVID safety precaution. We give thanks for every gift given today, for the opportunity to practice generosity together, and for the ways our gifts are more powerful together than they are apart. The offering will now be given and received with gratitude.
1, 2, 3, 4. Don't you know they're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper. Don't you know they're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper. While they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know they're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper. Poor people gonna rise up and get their share. Poor people gonna rise up and get what's theirs. Don't you know you better run, 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 run. Oh, I said you better run, 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 run. 'Cause finally the tables are starting to turn. Talk about a revolution, oh. Finally the tables are starting to turn. Talk about a revolution, hold on. Talk about a revolution, while they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know they're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper. And finally the tables are starting to turn. Talk about a revolution, oh. Yes, finally the tables are starting to turn. Talk about a revolution, oh, hold on. Talk about a revolution, hold on. Talk about a revolution, hold on.
May the gifts we have given fuel the flame of our commitment, empower us to serve out our mission, and give the life we share the shape of truth, love, and justice. I now invite you to join in humming the hymn Hope by Issei Barnwell. And if you're at home, you can sing it.
If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to pray on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to pray on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to pray on, pray on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to pray on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to walk on, walk on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to walk on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to work on, work on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to work on. If we want hope to survive in this world today, then every day we've got to move on.
I invite the congregation here with me in person to please rise in body or spirit as we extinguish our chalice and for the benediction. At home, if you want to rise too, please do so. Please join me in the words of chalice extinguishing. Carry the flame of peace and love until we meet again. Now, before I give the benediction, 2 quick invitations for those who are here with me in person today. First, don't forget to drop your cash or check for the offering at the back of the sanctuary into the plate on your way out after the service. And second, I hope you'll join me outside after the service today. Our children have created a living history exhibit as part of their RE class in keeping with our November theme of holding history. You won't want to miss it. And now, words of benediction written by my friend and colleague, Reverend Tom Shade. If you're able to link elbows instead of holding hands, I invite you to do so. My friends, there is a power at work in the universe. It works through human hands, but it was not made by human hands. It is a creative, sustaining, and transforming power, and we can trust that power with our lives. It will sustain us whenever we take a stand on the side of love, whenever we take a stand on the side of peace and justice, whenever we take a risk. Trust in that power. We are together held by that power. And now, our worship has ended and our service begins, and I invite you to join in humming and do whatever Deborah tells you to do for our postlude.
You may stay standing, or, because the invitation is going to be to get up, stand up. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights and dance if you want. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Preacher man, don't tell me heaven is under the earth. I know you don't know what life is really worth. It's not all that glitters is gold. Half the story has never been told, and now you see the light. You stand up for your rights right now. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Now, get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. You see, most people think a great God will come from the sky and take away everything and make everybody feel high. But if you know what life is worth, you would look for yours on earth. And now you see the light. You gotta stand up for your rights. Now, get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. We're sick and tired of your ism, schism game. Dine and go to heaven in our Jesus' name, Lord. We know when we understand divinity is in everyone. You can fool some people sometimes, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And now we see the light. We stand up for our rights right now. Get up, stand up. Stand up for our rights. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight, never give up. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Never give up the fight. Now get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. We won't give up the fight. One more time now. Get up, stand up. Stand up for our rights. Get up, stand up. Never give up the fight. Thank you, everyone. We're so delighted to be back with you in person.